The camera sweeps across the peaceful facade of First Community Bank in suburban Akron, Ohio, its red brick exterior and manicured landscaping embodying 3 decades of trusted service to the local community. The morning sun casts long shadows across the empty parking lot, but something is terribly wrong. Police tape flutters in the November breeze as FBI agents move methodically through the building's interior. Security footage plays on loop, showing a figure in uniform walking calmly through corridors with the confidence of someone who belongs there. Before we unravel how one man used a uniform and a keycard to steal millions in plain sight, like, subscribe, and drop a comment if you think this was an inside job from the very beginning. This is one story you won't believe, until you see every detail. He walked through the front doors like he had for 32 years. No mask, no gloves, just a spare key and a plan that would fool everyone. The voiceover continues over archival footage of the bank's busy lobby during normal operations. Customers conducting routine business, unaware that their trusted financial institution was about to become the scene of one of Ohio's most sophisticated inside jobs. $9.2 million vanished overnight from First Community Bank. No broken glass, no forced entry, no violence. Just one man who knew the building better than anyone alive and had been forgotten by everyone who mattered. Cut to FBI wanted poster showing Charles William Bennett, 67 years old, former bank security guard. The subtitle reads, "Still at large. Reward, $150,000. This is the story of how institutional memory, bureaucratic oversight, and one man's intimate knowledge of banking operations combined to create the perfect conditions for what investigators would later call the most audacious retirement plan in criminal history. Charles William Bennett had been part of the furniture at First Community Bank for so long that newer employees assumed he had always been there. At 67, he possessed the kind of institutional knowledge that large organizations value but rarely document properly. Hired in 1990 as a junior security officer, Charles had witnessed every major change, upgrade, and policy revision in the bank's operations over more than 3 decades. He knew which floorboards creaked, which doors stuck in humid weather, and where every security camera had blind spots that hadn't been addressed despite multiple system upgrades. During his tenure, Charles had earned a reputation for reliability that bordered on the legendary. He had never missed a scheduled shift, never filed a workers' compensation claim, and never given management any reason to question his loyalty or competence. Bank executives regularly cited him as an example of the kind of dedicated employee that made First Community Bank a pillar of the local business community. Charles had been issued emergency access keys during the bank's 2018 security renovation, when management decided that senior security personnel needed backup access to critical areas in case of system failures or natural disasters. The keys provided entry to the vault level, basement storage areas, and main electrical systems, essentially unrestricted access to every part of the building. When Charles retired in March 2022, with full pension benefits and a modest ceremony recognizing his 32 years of service, the transition was handled by human resources staff who had been with the bank for less than 5 years. The exit interview checklist included standard items like returning uniforms, badges, and company property, but no one specifically asked about the emergency access keys that had been issued 4 years earlier. The oversight wasn't malicious or even particularly careless by normal standards. Employee turnover in management positions had been high, and the institutional knowledge about which specific employees had been issued emergency keys had simply been lost in the routine shuffling of personnel and policy updates. Charles quietly stored the keys in his home office, initially intending to return them if anyone asked. But as weeks turned to months and no inquiry came, he began to realize that his continued possession of complete access to First Community Bank had been forgotten by the very institution he had served faithfully for over 3 decades. Living alone in a modest ranch house on the outskirts of Akron, Charles found retirement less fulfilling than anticipated. His pension was adequate for basic needs, but medical bills and prescription costs were consuming an increasing percentage of his fixed income. More troubling was his growing sense of invisibility. The bank's newsletter stopped mentioning his name, former colleagues rarely called, and his decades of dedicated service seemed to have been quickly forgotten. What Charles possessed that most retirees didn't, however, was detailed knowledge of exactly how much money moved through First Community Bank on any given day, and intimate familiarity with the security procedures designed to protect it. During his 32-year career, he had memorized schedules, patterns, and vulnerabilities that no current employee fully understood. By late 2023, Charles had begun to consider whether his forgotten keys and institutional knowledge might represent an opportunity that would never come again. The transformation of Charles Bennett from retired security guard to bank robber wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was the gradual recognition that his unique combination of access, knowledge, and anonymity had created an opportunity that might exist for only a limited time before someone realized the security oversight. Charles's financial situation had deteriorated steadily throughout 2023. His wife's medical expenses before her death the previous year had depleted their savings, and his pension wasn't sufficient to cover both mortgage payments and increasing healthcare costs. At 67, his employment options were extremely limited, and his pride prevented him from seeking assistance from social services or former colleagues. The catalyst for Charles's criminal planning came during a routine visit to the bank to conduct personal business. While waiting in line, he observed the current security procedures and realized that staff turnover had been so extensive that no one working there had been employed during his tenure. He was literally invisible to the current workforce, a familiar face that no one could quite place but that everyone assumed belonged there. More significantly, Charles noticed that the bank's security contractor had changed twice since his retirement, and the current guards were following procedures that he knew were suboptimal based on his intimate knowledge of the building's layout, surveillance system blind spots. The institutional knowledge that had once made him valuable as an employee now made him dangerous as a potential adversary. Charles began conducting careful reconnaissance during the bank's public hours, observing guard rotations, camera placements, and the timing of routine procedures. His 32 years of experience allowed him to quickly identify patterns and vulnerabilities that would be invisible to casual observers or even law enforcement personnel unfamiliar with the building's specific characteristics. The breakthrough in Charles's planning came when he realized that the bank's vault access system had never been fully upgraded after his retirement. The emergency keys he possessed would still provide entry to secure areas, and his knowledge of manual override procedures would allow him to bypass certain electronic security measures that newer employees might not even know existed. Charles studied the bank's holiday schedule and identified Thanksgiving weekend as the optimal timing for his operation. The extended holiday period would mean reduced staff presence, modified security procedures, and delayed discovery of any irregularities. More importantly, his knowledge of past holiday protocols told him that certain automated security functions would be temporarily suspended to prevent false alarms during the period when the building would be unoccupied. The technical preparation for Charles's heist demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both the bank's physical security and its operational procedures. He acquired a security uniform similar to those worn by the current contractor, obtained tools that would allow him to access areas his keys couldn't reach, and identified a vehicle that could transport large amounts of cash without attracting attention. Charles's most clever innovation involved creating a false identity using the credentials of a deceased military veteran whose personal information was available through public records. The identity provided him with the documentation necessary to rent vehicles and conduct other preparations without creating a trail that could be traced back to his real name. By November 2023, Charles had spent nearly 8 months preparing for what he privately referred to as his retirement bonus. He had studied every aspect of the operation, identified the optimal timing and methods, and prepared contingency plans for various scenarios that might arise during the execution of his crime. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Use his legitimate access and institutional knowledge to enter the bank during a period of minimal security, remove as much cash as possible without triggering immediate alarms, and disappear before anyone realized that a crime had been committed. Charles estimated that he would have at least 48 hours before the theft was discovered, and possibly much longer if his execution was as precise as his planning. At 3:14 a.m. on Friday, November 24th, Charles Bennett began executing what would become one of the most audacious bank robberies in Ohio history. The timing wasn't accidental. Charles knew from decades of experience that the overnight security guard would be on his scheduled restroom break, and the building's automated systems would be in their most vulnerable configuration during the holiday weekend. Charles arrived at First Community Bank driving a rented panel van that he had obtained using his false identity 3 days earlier. He parked in the service area behind the building, wearing a security uniform that closely resembled those used by the current contractor. To any casual observer, he appeared to be a legitimate security personnel conducting routine checks during the holiday period. The service entrance key that Charles had retained from his employment fit perfectly into the lock that hadn't been changed since the building's 2018 renovation. The electronic access panel recognized his keycard as valid, though the system couldn't identify which current employee was entering the building. Charles had gambled correctly that the holiday programming would record his entry as a routine security check rather than triggering an alert. Moving through the building's corridors with the confidence of someone who had walked them thousands of times, Charles made his way to the vault level using routes that avoided the primary surveillance cameras. His institutional knowledge of the building's security system allowed him to exploit blind spots that current employees didn't even know existed. The vault access procedure required both a physical key and a 6-digit access code that changed monthly. However, Charles knew about the manual override system that had been installed as a backup in case of electronic failures. Using techniques he had learned during emergency drills decades earlier, he was able to bypass the electronic locks and open the vault without triggering any of the primary security alerts. Inside the vault, Charles found exactly what his reconnaissance had suggested: approximately $9.2 million in small denomination bills that had been prepared for ATM replenishment operations following the holiday weekend. The money was organized in transport-ready containers that could be moved efficiently by someone familiar with the bank's cash handling procedures. Working with methodical precision, Charles transferred the currency from its vault storage locations into canvas bags that he had brought for this specific purpose. His knowledge of the bank's cash counting and audit procedures allowed him to select bundles that would be missed least quickly during routine inventory checks. The entire vault access operation took 23 minutes. Well within the window Charles had calculated based on his knowledge of guard rotation schedules and surveillance system limitations. He resealed the vault using the same override procedures he had used to open it, ensuring that casual inspections wouldn't immediately reveal that anything was missing. Charles loaded the stolen currency into his rental van using a service cart that he had taken from the building's supply closet. To anyone who might have observed the operation, it would have appeared to be routine cash transfer procedures conducted by authorized security personnel during the holiday period. The final phase of Charles's operation involved creating false evidence that would initially direct suspicion away from an inside job. He deliberately left certain areas of the building in configurations that would suggest external intrusion, while avoiding any actions that would definitively prove forced entry had occurred. At 3:52 a.m., Charles departed First Community Bank with $9.2 million in stolen currency, leaving behind no fingerprints, no witnesses, and no immediate evidence that a crime had been committed. His knowledge of the building's systems and procedures had allowed him to execute the theft during a window of vulnerability that he had identified through decades of legitimate employment. The rental van disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness of suburban Akron, carrying Charles Bennett toward a new life that he had purchased with institutional knowledge and a set of forgotten keys. By the time bank employees discovered the theft, Charles would be hundreds of miles away, beginning a disappearance that would challenge every assumption about retirement, security, and institutional memory. Tuesday morning, November 28th, began as a routine post-holiday reopening for First Community Bank staff. Vault Operations Manager Jennifer Walsh arrived at 7:30 a.m. to prepare for the week's cash transfer operations, unaware that she was about to discover one of the most sophisticated bank thefts in Ohio's recent history. The first indication of trouble came during Jennifer's preliminary inventory of the cash reserves that should have been replenished during the holiday weekend. The vault's electronic logs showed no unauthorized access, and the physical security appeared undamaged, but the currency storage areas were obviously depleted far beyond what normal holiday ATM usage could explain. A systematic count revealed the devastating truth: $9.2 million in small denomination bills had vanished from the vault. The theft had been so precisely executed that it initially appeared to bank staff that the missing money might represent an accounting error or misplaced transfer documentation. Emergency protocols were activated immediately. FBI agents arrived within hours and began what would become one of the most challenging financial crime investigations in the region's history. The complete absence of forced entry, Disabled alarms or obvious security breaches initially suggested that the theft had been committed by someone with legitimate access to the building. The breakthrough came when investigators reviewed the building's access logs and discovered an unidentified keycard entry at 3:14 a.m. on November 24th. The electronic system recorded the access as legitimate, but couldn't match it to any current employee. Further investigation revealed that the entry had been made using credentials that were still valid, but belonged to someone no longer employed by the bank. FBI forensic specialists quickly identified Charles Bennett as the most likely suspect based on his unique combination of continued access, intimate building knowledge, and absence from his residence. When agents arrived at Charles's suburban home, they found that the property had been sold 3 weeks earlier and completely cleared of personal belongings. Financial records revealed that Charles had systematically liquidated his assets throughout the fall of 2023, converting retirement accounts, personal property, and investments into untraceable cash. The preparation had been so gradual and unremarkable that it attracted no attention from financial monitoring systems designed to detect suspicious activity. The investigation revealed the sophisticated nature of Charles's planning and execution. The rental van used in the theft had been obtained using false identification based on the credentials of a deceased military veteran. Security camera footage showed a figure in uniform moving confidently through the bank, but the individual's face was never clearly visible, and his movements demonstrated intimate familiarity with surveillance blind spots. Most troubling for investigators was the realization that Charles had possessed the keys and knowledge necessary to commit this theft for nearly 2 years after his retirement, and that institutional oversight failures had allowed him to retain access that should have been revoked immediately upon his departure from employment. The FBI's manhunt for Charles Bennett expanded rapidly as the scope of his preparation became clear. Border security agencies were notified, and surveillance was established at airports, bus terminals, and major highways throughout the Midwest. However, Charles appeared to have anticipated these standard law enforcement responses and had prepared countermeasures. The last verified sighting of Charles Bennett occurred 48 hours after the theft was discovered at a truck stop in Laredo, Texas, near the Mexican border. Surveillance footage showed a man matching his description, purchasing supplies and fuel, but by the time local authorities arrived at the location, he had disappeared. International law enforcement agencies were contacted, and extensive investigations suggested that Charles had likely crossed into Central America, where his military pension and stolen funds would provide a comfortable lifestyle beyond the reach of American law enforcement. However, no definitive evidence of his border crossing or current location has ever been obtained. The stolen $9.2 million remains missing and untraceable. Charles had selected currency that would be virtually impossible to identify once introduced into normal commercial circulation, and his knowledge of banking procedures had allowed him to target money that wouldn't be immediately missed during routine operations. Charles Bennett remains on the FBI's most wanted list, with a $150,000 reward offered for information leading to his capture. The case has become a cautionary tale about institutional security, employee transition procedures, and the vulnerabilities created when organizations lose track of who has access to their most sensitive assets. The investigation continues, but after more than 2 years, law enforcement officials privately acknowledged that Charles Bennett may have successfully disappeared with his stolen retirement fund. His crime demonstrated that sometimes the most dangerous threats come from those who are most familiar with the systems they choose to exploit.